Hello, everybody. So this is Bio 101, Chapter 15, Conserving Biodiversity. And we're going to be looking at community and ecosystem ecology. So only for learning outcomes this time, be able to explain the evidence that suggests we are entering a mass extinction and list the causes of such extinction, list and describe the consequences of extinction, explain the three types of species interactions, and list ways in which you can help prevent the loss of biodiversity. So the cute little story that they tell at the start of the chapter to try to get us engaged in the material, asks, what is the cause of the population crash for rufous red knot shorebirds? And the eggs of the horseshoe crabs are the primary food source for the rufous red knots when they're migrating. And since those horseshoe crabs are extremely over harvested, the loss of food for the shorebirds has caused the population crash of the shorebirds. And it's kind of interesting why we harvest horseshoe crabs. If you want to be utterly fascinated by a particular species on this planet, check out why we harvest horseshoe crab blood. We use it in biology because it is just truly a unique and amazing compound. And I wonder too how we learned what we could use horseshoe crab blood for, but you'll have to look that up. They're just fascinating. Okay, so the sixth extinction. This is the chapter section we're starting with, and we're starting with the sixth extinction and the term the Endangered Species Act. So in 1973, a US law was passed to protect and encourage population growth of threatened and endangered species. This was due to concerns about losing the diversity. Biodiversity is, the variety of living organisms in a particular ecosystem, in this case, Earth. And it is in response to what we're seeing is just unprecedented and rapid rate of species loss. It's utterly depressing to hear the numbers of just how much we've lost. So at the time of writing this book, there are 10 million species that are endangered. We only have 1% of all the species that have ever existed. And there's all kinds of things that are currently endangered just because of humans. Whooping crane, passenger pigeon, this adorable little black-footed ferret, oh, that little face, and then a spotted skunk are just 4 tiny little examples. So the history of extinction, extinction happens. Like that's not because of humans. Extinction does happen, and there have been 5 mass extinctions, but we are in the middle of the 6th massive extinction, and it is larger than the others, predictably. So background extinction rates, we can tell background extinction rates by looking at fossils. The average lifespan of a species is about 1 million years. So the background extinction rate is about 1 millionth of a percent per year. Our current extinction rate is calculated from what species we know are disappearing. And it's kind of hard to calculate while you're in the middle of a mass extinction because it's hard to document. When something disappears, sometimes you don't know it's gone. Sometimes you didn't know it was here to know it was gone. And that would mean you'd have to look at all individuals in all locations. And the standard definition of extinct means no individuals of the species for 50 years. That's an incredibly long time. So here's just an idea. in the last 150 years, just humans. The last 150 years, how many birds and mammals have gone extinct compared to the previous almost twice as long? 3 times as many. 3 times as many in almost half as much time. Yep, we're definitely not being good stewards of our planet. Um, Modern extinction is much greater than history has shown us. And primary causes of the extinction, um, I want to be like humans, and humans, but it is loss of habitat or degradation. I mean, yes, loss of habitat can happen, but humans are sprawling and we are taking over other habitats. Introduction of non-native species. We are living in a global climate right now where, you can jump on a plane and you can be in a completely different hemisphere, continent in just a few hours. And species are coming and they're disrupting the balance and wiping out entire other populations. Over exploitation, poaching, certainly, and then don't forget about like the horseshoe crabs, using their blood. That's over exploitation. And pollution, definitely pollution, and that's 100% humans. So, what cause of extinction poses the most serious threat to biodiversity, though, out of all of those? Loss of habitat. Yeah, loss of habitat. So, of the ones that are endangered, 83% of mammals, 89% of birds, and 91% of plants are because of loss of habitat, human sprawl. Why are we doing this? Agricultural, industrial, residential, but this is also affecting all the ecosystems. Yeah. Okay, species area curve. So this is a term that we have to know so that we can understand populations. So it's the relationship between the size of an area and the number of species that are in that area that are supported by it. So don't confuse this with like carrying capacity. This is how many are, not a projection. And so at present, that global habitat destruction, 25% of species could be extinct within 50 years. And there is a species area curve, and we use that to predict extinction. So when that species area curve shrinks, you're losing numbers of species. Let me go back and explain that a little bit better. So the more area that you have, the more species you can you can support up to a point. You can see it starting to curve, but as you go down in area, you are able to support less species. And this is, in half, and this is by 90%. And so that's why we're predicting 50% destruction or loss of species. So habitat fragmentation is large areas that get broken up. This is habitat destruction. This is one of the ways that habitat destruction happens. It's by breaking up those large areas, and that's really important for large species that need like lots of area to gather enough food to support their bodies and their populations. So if you break up a huge swathe of land, then they have less resources accessible to them. We need to think about the food chain for the next thing. So the food chain, you start out with the sun, which allows our producers, our photosynthesizers, to create glucose from carbon dioxide, and they convert that glucose into energy and carbon inside their their cells, and so they bring carbon into a solid form. And then the primary consumers are the herbivores, the ones that eat the green stuff. I mean, this could be algae and fish too, but we usually think about like mammals. And then you have the secondary consumers, and those are the meat eaters. Um, and so, if you interrupt any spot on this food chain, then you're going to disrupt everybody else. So there's this trophic pyramid where, if you disrupt the top, you're not going to, you actually can disrupt those below, because they're going to overgrow and they're going to eat more grass. Um, and if you disrupt the primary consumers, then there's nobody for the top of the food chain. So then there's also introduced species. So what happens is introduced species have not co-evolved with the other species in that ecosystem, which means that they haven't been subject to the same selective pressures or the same balances within that ecosystem. And so if they happen to have a fitness advantage, or even if they don't, even if they're just competitive, even if it's not an advantage, they're just competitive, they will disrupt that delicate balance of that ecosystem. So the vines that are overgrowing native trees, they're choking them out. They're physically blocking access to sunlight. Maybe nobody eats those vines, so they're not taking the place of something. They're actually excluding something in the food chain. Zebra mussels are a big problem in our Great Lakes. And that's because they compete with native mussels. They outcompete native mussels, which means that they are overgrowing, and that's a problem. So I keep saying coevolution. Coevolution is when pairs or groups of species adapt to each other via natural selection. So species that have not co-evolved with those introduced species, that's going to cause lots of problems. So if you drop in an introduced species, you can completely wipe out other populations. Then there's over exploitation. This is probably one of the most human-centric reasons why animals are being wiped out. Whether it's the vanity of having an exotic pet or some sort of misplaced medicinal value, whatever that may be, or even if it's just like, not understanding that, that there needs to be a balance and that we need to coexist with the other species within our ecosystem, like just killing wolves because wolves are scary. We don't like wolves. Wolves take out your sheep once in a while. And think about this, like we've sectioned off huge swathes of land to grow sheep and cattle. And we've taken that land from the wolf, and then we kill the wolf. And then over harvesting ocean species like chicken of the sea. Well, maybe not so much. Maybe there's not an unlimited supply of being able to just pull tuna out of the sea. I say chicken of the sea, I should explain. That's a sales slogan of a particular popular tuna brand. They're called the chicken of the sea, and I suppose it's meant to suggest that there is an unlimited supply, but there is not. And so over harvesting is definitely a problem. And then there's pollution. Oh boy, pollution. Pollution isn't just trash. It's runoff of fertilizer from agricultural fields. It's oil and spills. And so there's all kinds of things that can cause pollution. And one of the things that pollution can do, like I said, it's runoff of fertilizer. Um, yeah, excess growth of bacteria, excess growth of algae that so there's usually a limiting nutrient that prevents the overgrowth of a particular population. And with algae, it's often phosphorus. Remember CHNOPS for organic molecules. Phosphorus is usually the limiting one. Well, if you have phosphate runoff from inorganic fertilizers into water, that algae no longer has that limit to population growth, because now it has limitless, well, seemingly limitless phosphate. And so it will bloom. And by blooming, I mean grow unchecked. And it will grow and it will actually exclude, it will, be on the surface of the water so that it can get the most sunlight for photosynthesis, but it actually chokes off that water. And that's what that eutrophication means. It actually stops oxygen from diffusing deeper into the water because it's physically blocking it in a thick mat. So caused by excess fertilizer runoff results in large kill off because fish breathe oxygen dissolved in water. You can think about the red tide in the Yangtze River. That's an example of eutrophication. Oh dear, carbon dioxide. We're causing climate change with our awful pollution. I don't know if you have ever heard of Trash Island, which is like bigger than the state of Texas, I think it is. Just floating in the ocean, and it is just absolute trash. That's all it is. So yeah, we got some problems, and so we're causing these problems. And what is it going to cost us? Well, and everybody else on this planet, it's causing the loss of resources, either direct or indirect. It's disrupting energy flow and nutrient cycling. And it makes a lot of us darn sad. And that's not even just being flippant. That's for real. So direct loss of biological resources, if you chop down all the trees so that you can build a golf course, you're not going to have any wood for fuel. If you overharvest the creatures of the sea, then their population is not going to be able to bounce back because they're not going to be able to reproduce at the rate you're harvesting. You lose the opportunity, for some of the things that we might not even know. We might not even know that this plant could be used for medicine because we've annihilated the forest in which it grows. So, some of the reasons why we want to preserve biodiversity, and why we don't, money. It's probably good to bring up money because if you lose species, you lose money, but also you lose opportunities, and you create a genetic bottleneck. You lose some of the genetic diversity, and you lose ways for those those organisms to be viable. So indirect loss is within the community. So I keep saying it, it's a delicate balance, and all of the organisms, that have co-evolved together have this balance, and they have this place in the ecosystem. It's called the ecological niche. And we benefit from the plants and animals around us. And so if we lose those resources, you fog for mosquitoes in your yard, and now the bats suffer because they don't have anything to eat. And you've also poisoned all the honeybees, and now the honeybees can't pollinate the flowers of the soybeans in the field nearby. And now the soybeans that were supposed to grow can't be used for food for the cows. I don't know if cows eat soybeans. I'm just saying. And then you can't eat the hamburger, or maybe you're vegetarian, you can't eat the soybeans. So, it's indirect too because of that food web, because of that very complex linkage. So mutualism, this is another example of how we can indirectly lose resources um, by affecting populations. If you affect the cleaner fish that eat parasites from the larger fish, then you're affecting the larger fish too. That's just one example. Oh, look, honeybees. There you go. There's another example. And it's not just honeybees, I should say pollinators. Pollinators in general, not just bees, but moths and butterflies and other pollinating insects, wasps, and I'm trying to think of another pollinating insect, but they're all important to us, and we want lots of diversity, because I can tell you just from watching my own honeybees, my honeybees can get into sunflowers that the bumblebees cannot. And then there's these little hoverflies, which are pollinators, which are fascinating little flying gemstones, and they're even smaller, and they can get into the places my honeybees cannot. So we need diversity so that we can pollinate all the different types of plants. Commensalism is when one organism benefits and the other one is unaffected. So yeah, they've got the egrets feeding on the insects of the cattle. The cow doesn't really seem to care. Sometimes we all need the zen of the cow, I think, but that's commensalism. So if mutualism is like a plus relationship, commensalism is like a plus zero, meaning no change. Predators eat other things. So those are, we think of cheetahs and eagles and killer whales, but you might even think of songbirds. Songbirds are predators if they eat insects. Oh, there you go. Wow, look at me. It's almost as if I knew what the next slide was. I really didn't look. Predators, and an example of a predator would be an insect-eating bird. So competition. So this one's interesting. Microbial competition affects our biology. This is a great example. So in our gut, we have what's called a biofilm. So we have all kinds of bacteria in our gut. So anything that's basically exposed to the outside, and since we're just one open tube from mouth to anus, we have microbes all on that path, and competition affects us. So before I talk about this, we have this biofilm of good bacteria. So you may have heard of E. coli, Escherichia coli, and you may think it's a bad thing, but you are coated in it on the inside. And that's good, because that thick biofilm of Escherichia coli and Klebsiella pneumoniae and Lactobacillus species, those ones are all good for us because they create this coating which prevents invading species like Salmonella enteritidis here, or Shigella, from being able to attach themselves into our intestinal lining and cause disease. So we have this wonderful, you could say it's commensalistic, like it benefits them and not us, because they're eating our food, they're helping us digest. But you could also, and maybe more likely, say it's mutualistic, because we benefit them by providing them food, and they benefit us by being one of our first lines of defense against invaders. But yeah, so microbial competition also can affect things in this way. So competition in regards to chickens is an interesting competitive exclusion story too. Um, yeah, not gonna. So the effects, oh, well, antibiotics to treat bacterial infections can also kill beneficial bacteria. That's true. Beneficial bacteria balance out. So, for example, in the vagina, there are species called lactobacillus, and they ferment and create an acidic environment. And there are also resident flora of yeast called Candida albicans, and both of them are benign. And what happens is the yeast prevent the overgrowth of the bacteria by competing for food resources, and the bacteria prevent the overgrowth of the yeast by creating that acidic environment. But if you take antibiotics and you wipe out the resident flora of your bacteria in the vaginal community, a yeast infection can arise. And if you do not have a vagina, you are not um, immune to this, because that same yeast can also reside in the mouth, and an overgrowth of yeast in the mouth is called thrush. So, and I'm going to, of course, could be able to speak very intelligently on that one. And the mosquitoes and tadpoles is another example of when you increase one population, the other population is going to decrease. And then don't forget, then that increased population is going to affect other species, like West Nile is going to bloom, and yellow fever virus is going to bloom, and humans then are going to get sick. So what is a keystone species? Well, a keystone species is basically the one that if you lost that keystone species, the rest of the community would fall. So where does that come from? When you're building an arch, the keystone is the last brick in that arch, and it's the one that uses the weight of all the other bricks to hold it in, and it in turn holds all of them in, and that's how you can build an arch. It's actually an incredibly strong structure, but if you were to pull any one of those out, but if you were to pull that one out, that arch has to be supported until the keystone brick is put in. So once it's put in, then it is self-supporting, and so the keystone species, by analogy then, is the species that if you pulled it out, the whole rest of the community would collapse, or at least have the strongest effect on that community. So an effect of keystone species, we lost a lot of species of trees due to predation by elk, because the gray wolves were exterminated in Yellowstone. So the gray wolves were hunted and killed, and then the elk, just because they weren't being eaten by the wolves, the elk just grew in population completely unchecked, and they needed food. And so what did they do? They ate all the trees to the point where the trees were then threatened. So you put the wolves back in, they keep the elk in check, and the trees come back. And what is that good for? Well, trees are good for beavers, birds, insects, fish, all the other stuff. It's a very delicate balance. Okay, disruption of energy flow. Well, I kind of talked about this already. You've got this food chain. So if you take somebody out of that food chain, you're going to end up disrupting the energy flow. You're going to disrupt the transfer of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, because organic material is made from those things. So you're going to disrupt that if you disrupt any of the different species. So I think maybe when I did that explanation, I jumped the gun on this particular slide. Yep. Aw, they're talking about the bacteria in soil. This was a lot of what my graduate work is, because I argued, and it's true, that the health of the soil, the biodiversity in soil, actually affects crop yield and productivity. It affects the plant yield and productivity above the soil. And so I argued that if you want to have, good agriculture, you really want to be paying attention to the microbes beneath the soil as part of that complete ecosystem. Yay. Yep. Bacteria and fungi are primary decomposers. And if you were to have a non-native earthworm that eats the bacteria, that's what earthworms eat. They eat bacteria and fungi. Then you're gonna wipe out these populations. And because the health of the soil and the organic matter in the soil, meaning the bacteria and the nutrients that they're cycling, some bacteria can actually pull nitrogen right out of the air and convert it into a usable form. And remember, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So it's an incredibly important part of our nutrient cycling. Think nitrogenous base in DNA, or the amino group in an amino acid of protein. Everything requires nitrogen. So if you destroy those microbes, you're going to destroy the plants above the ground too. All right. So the third negative impact is that negative biological effect. And I made a little joke about it, but the truth is, like, people have studied this, and being in nature and being around other organisms and appreciating, that ecosystem diversity seems to really have a profound psychological effect on humans. And there's no genetic base for that, but people definitely seem to be happier when they have some time to be with nature. And happier, what does that mean? It means you're going to be less stressed. You might even live a little longer. It depends on your relationship and how you interpret that experience. But certainly loss of biodiversity could make the experience a lot less pleasant. I know it makes me sad to think about not ever being able to see a polar bear in my life, for example. Okay, couple review questions. What type of symbiotic relationship benefits both the cleaner fish and consuming parasites? So plus relationship, which one was plus? Do you remember? Mutualism is plus. Okay, saving species. So, there are biodiversity hotspots, and we want to be paying attention to those. These are the ones where we really need to focus our efforts to stop destroying the habitat, especially since that seems to be the biggest one. And where are the ways that we can do that? Well, stop converting land to agricultural production. And by that it means eat lower on the food chain. Because if you think about it, you could eat a whole apple for a meal and be satisfied. But if you were to give that apple to a cow, he's going to need 5 apples to be satisfied in order for you to be able to eat the cow. And so the higher up on the food chain, the more resources go into that particular organism. And if you eat lower on the food chain, it takes less energy to feed. We got to stop using paper and wood products. If we do, they got to be from sustainably harvested sources. Really, honestly, the financial aid to developing countries, and also paying attention to our government and our governmental policies, because businesses don't care about biodiversity. They care about dollars. And then also slowing population growth rates. And not so much growth rates of species, but humans, because we're the source of a lot of this. But population growth rates are ways to slow extinction. Now, the small populations with slow growth rates are the ones that are at the most risk if you're thinking about particular species and trying to bring them back. So things like elephants. Protected biodiversity and humans' needs. So the Endangered Species Act, you know, that's one particular success story. Taking actions to preserve biodiversity, prevention, reduce use of fossil fuels, reduce meat consumption, reduce pollution, and you know, educate yourself and others. I would say educate yourself on governmental policies, local, state, and federal. So hopefully you can answer these 4 learning outcomes now, and this is the end of chapter 15.